This video is now in session, and the Senate election in 2022 may actually be a lot closer than a lot of people may think. The Democrats have a pretty good shot at retaining the Senate in 2022, even in a Republican wave year. If you look at 538's forecast, you'll see that the Democrats have a 46% chance of winning in the Senate. And in our outlook, which we released on June 27th, so a few days ago, we actually think that the Democrats are somewhat likely to hold this to retain the Senate. And the reason why comes down to two factors. The first, or it comes down to multiple factors, but and you see two of these factors here. But yeah, the first factor is that this is a well-timed Senate map. If you look here, there are no seats up for election in Michigan or Minnesota or West Virginia, where Joe Manchin is, or Montana, where John Tester is, or Ohio, where Sherrod Brown is. So because there aren't those Democratic incumbents who are up for re-election in Trump-won states in 2020 for 2022, that's actually pretty lucky for the Democratic Party. The other aspect is that incumbency, or the other aspect that I don't mention here, is that incumbency is very important for the Senate, much more important than the House side, because when you get incumbency as a senator, that usually comes along with name recognition. You probably know the name of your senator, but not the name of your representative. If you are in a state like Virginia, for example, you may know that Mark Warner is the senator of Virginia, but you may not know that Elaine Luria is the representative of your district. So name recognition does matter in the Senate much more than in the House. And then also there are bad Republican candidates for a ton of these races. And then it's also a well-timed map for the Democrats. So because of those three reasons, we think that the Democrats will most likely hold the Senate. But let's look at these individual races. So in New Hampshire voted for Biden by around 7 percentage points, and Maggie Hassan is the incumbent senator. So because of that, we actually think that New Hampshire will stay Democratic in 2022. Since Maggie Hassan did well enough to flip this seat in 2016 from Kelly Ayotte, the incumbent Republican senator at that time. And if you look at the polls, you'll see that for the most part, she has led in every single one of those polls except for this one poll by the University of New Hampshire of Chuck Morris. So overall, we'd say this is lean Democratic, given the 2020 election and as well as the incumbency factor. Now, if we look at, I'm going to skip Pennsylvania because that will be interesting later on. North Carolina, many people may be surprised that we rate this as likely instead of lean. North Carolina has historically always under-delivered for the Democratic Party. Many people thought Joe Biden would flip this state in 2020. They didn't. If you look at 2016, many people thought Hillary Clinton would flip this state. They didn't. If you look at the Senate race in 2020, Cal Cunningham was supposed to, the Democratic nominee was supposed to unseat the incumbent Tom Tillis, but he didn't. So because of that, we still think that North Carolina will once again under-deliver for the Democrats. And given that people's expectations for this year are lean Republican, if we account for that fact of overperformance on the Republican end, then we rate this as likely Republican. And Ted Budd is generally a good candidate. Ted Budd's the Republican nominee, by the way. So because he's a good Republican nominee, it gives more credibility for this seat to be likely Republican. And I know that a ton of Democrats want Marco Rubio to go away, but the thing is, the Florida Democrats are just in shambles. They haven't gotten their act together. Meanwhile, the Florida Republicans have been better than ever. So because of that, it's likely Republican. Georgia will be one of the most important Senate races for both the Democrats and the Republicans, because it's one of the most likely seats alongside Pennsylvania that can flip to the other side. So if we look at the polls in Georgia, for now until now, they've mostly been in favor of Herschel Walker, and that's because Georgia has been trending blue, and it did flip to President Biden by tilt margins in 2020, but the thing is, Georgia flipped a little bit too much in 2020, which is that and what I mean by that is, there's a natural progression that a lot of states have towards one party, one side or the other. If you look at California, the switch from the Republican Party to the Reaganites to the Democratic Party, it took place over several years. But in 2020, there was a big swing from Georgia by around like 5 percentage points from likely Republican in 2016 to tilt Democratic. And that kind of swing is a little bit too much for a state, for a progression of politics. So we think it will swing a little bit back towards the Republican Party in 2022, and then over time it will shift back to the Democratic Party. But because it swung so much to the left in 2020, it's quite possible that it will shift some amount back to the right in 2022. But there can be a case to be made that the incumbent senator Raphael Warnock could actually keep the seat because he has campaigned himself as a moderate, as a as a person who can appeal to both the Atlantean Democrats and as well as suburban voters. So because of that, there is a very high chance that Raphael Warnock could actually retain the seat. Now, moving down through the Sun Belt, if you look at Colorado, we think that's likely Democratic, just because Colorado has been shifting to the left more so than a state like Virginia. In Arizona, we rate this as lean Democratic because Mark Kelly is an exceptionally good candidate for a swing state. And then the other aspect is that the leading Republican right now is Blake Masters, and Blake Masters has a lot of baggage with moderates. He is well liked in the conservative community for his conservative views, but because of his conservative comments, he is not as suitable as a candidate for the general election. So because of that, we think that this seat will be lean Democratic. So that's Arizona. If we look at Nevada, Nevada is actually, in our opinion, more of a toss-up than Arizona, and that's because Catherine Cortez Masto doesn't have the same kind of name recognition that Mark Kelly has in his state. Catherine Cortez Masto, her rise came kind of quietly after Harry Reid, one of the most well-known Senate Majority Leaders, after he retired. So because of that, because of less name recognition in Nevada for Cortez Masto compared to Kelly in Arizona, and also because Adam Laxalt has had a statewide position before, it's still lean Democratic since Nevada has shown to be inelastic in its voting patterns, but it is very doable for Adam Laxalt to actually flip this seat compared to someone like Blake Masters. If you look at the aggregate polling from 538, Cortez Masto only leads by 0.9 percentage points against Adam Laxalt, and 15.2% of the Nevadan electorate is undecided. So there's a lot of movement that could happen in Nevada. Utah, you might be confused as to why Utah is likely Republican instead of safe Republican, and that's because Utah votes a little bit weirdly. Even though it's a strong Republican state, it does like to go against Donald Trump, and what's happening in this race is that the two candidates, Evan McMullin is attacking Mike Lee, the incumbent senator, a ton on Donald Trump, and Mike Lee has campaigned as a Trump candidate. So because of that, and because of the surprise in polls that we've seen, we rate the seat as likely instead of safe. Now, it's pretty obvious that Mike Lee will win this state unless some major scandal comes up, but it's not going to be as close as or as easy as 2016. So that's the entire West Coast. We could talk about Alaska. So a Republican is very likely to win in this state, but we rate it as lean R just because we're saying it's lean towards Murkowski, towards Lisa Murkowski. Lisa Murkowski has been in this situation before, and she's the incumbent Republican senator. She's been in this position in, I believe, 2010 when Joe Miller defeated Lisa Murkowski in the Republican primary. So Murkowski could have just left, but instead she decided to stay, and she actually won that race in 2010 in the general election as a write-in candidate. So that gives a lot of credibility for her to win in 2022 against under a similar set of conditions, in that Kelly Tshibaka is going against Murkowski because Murkowski has been viewed as too moderate, just like how Joe Miller went against Murkowski in 2010 because many people viewed Murkowski as too moderate at that time. So we think that this is more favorable to Murkowski, but the reason why we don't say it's likely, the reason why we say it's lean instead of likely Murkowski, is that Trump does have a lot more popularity in Alaska than Joe Miller, so it will probably be a closer race. So that's the West Coast. Now moving back to the Rust Belt. So Missouri, we have a likely Republican, primarily because Eric Greitens does have a ton of baggage as given his blackmail scandals as governor, and he was also forced out of the governorship by his own party. So we rate it as a likely Republican. And the other thing is that for all the types of scandals, there are the scandals that typically produce the most amount of damage are sex scandals, and Eric Greitens is implicated in a sex scandal. Now, this isn't to say Eric Greitens will be the Republican nominee. The primary hasn't happened yet, but according to primary polls, he is most likely to win against his main opponent, Eric Schmidt. So for that reason, we think Eric Greitens will be the presumed nominee, just like 538 says. But we don't think he'll win by safe margins, just like how 538 says it. So that's Missouri. Wisconsin, we rate this as lean Republican, primarily because Ron Johnson, even though he has even though his views are very much different to the Wisconsin electorate, he is ultimately the incumbent senator. And even though Wisconsin has had a history of overturning incumbent candidates, Ron Johnson is the incumbent senator in a Republican wave year, and he is a Republican. So we think that Wisconsin, a state that Joe Biden won by very narrow margins in 2020, we think that he'll most likely win re-election. Ohio, moving on to Ohio. Ohio is pretty interesting because polls have actually shown Tim Ryan to be relatively close against J.D. Vance in this state. If you look at the polls here, if we go down, you'll see that in this Democratic pollster, Tim Ryan is up by 3 points. Now, obviously, it's a Democratic pollster, so it's gonna skew more towards the Democratic side. But if we look at the Suffolk University poll, you'll see that J.D. Vance is only up by 3 percentage points against Tim Ryan. What explains this, you may ask? And I've been actually trying to figure out why J.D. Vance is not doing that well in these polls, and it may come down to the fact that J.D. Vance is like a flip-flopper. So in 2016, he lamented Donald Trump's comments and his candidacy, going so far as to call himself a never Trumper. And then all of a sudden in the 2022 primary, he flips to being a conservative. Now he's a super Trumper, and now he is heavily in favor towards Trump. So because of that, a lot of people don't kind of see him as not authentic. The other aspect is that J.D. Vance is not quite similar to the Ohioan electorate. The Ohioan electorate does have suburban elitists or suburban voters, but it's primarily working class voters that have the that have the, I guess, political zeitgeist of Ohio. But JD Vance isn't very well known as someone who can relate to working class voters in the same way that Tim Ryan does have relatability. So because of that, because of the relatability factor and the inauthenticity of JD Vance, this race is actually turning out a lot closer than expected. But it will still most likely stay Republican just because of how much Ohio has shifted to the right in the past few years. But a state that hasn't shifted that much to the right in the past few years is Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania will be the most important state in 2022. And the reason why is because this state has the highest chance of flipping from being in control of the Republicans from the 2016 election towards the Democrats. And the reason why is because John Fetterman is a populist. He is well known by the Pennsylvania electorate, and he is very well liked by the working class voters of Pennsylvania, a demographic that the Democrats lost by a lot in the past half decade or so. And then the other factor is Mehmet Oz. Mehmet Oz doesn't actually really live in Pennsylvania. He really lives in my home state of New Jersey, and because of that, a lot of people call him a carpetbagger. And for the Midwest, a ton of people in the Midwest come from the Midwest. A lot of people in Pennsylvania have had roots there for a ton of time. So the fact that you all of a sudden have a wealthy Republican businessman essentially come from a liberal state from New Jersey, it doesn't really taste that well to a ton of the Pennsylvania electorate. So because of those two, because of that dichotomy, we think that Fetterman will actually flip this state from Republican to Democratic, even in a Republican wave year, and that has mostly matched with the polls and as well as 538's forecast. So that's all the races, major races to look at for 2022. You can look at these races for yourself at partisanirony.com, and you can see all the races that you should watch out for. There are a total of 9 races that we say are key races to watch. And yeah, if you want to look at this race or the House race or the governor's races, you are very free to do so. And that's pretty much it. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.